anything that I do. Basically, I've got a natural resource management background, but in recent years I've been quite heavily getting more and more, I suppose, involved with being drawn in to help with rewilding projects and other projects that are working to reinvigorate, I suppose. Nature at scale is a nice way of phrasing it. Yeah, I've worked in a lot of different countries, so I will draw a little bit on that, but I'm really going to focus on the UK. Also, following some of the conversations Jim and I have had, Jim said, you know, sort of get into some of the nuancing, help people understand a bit more about what rewilding is, as opposed to just the standard stuff that you tend to hear about. So hopefully there'll be a few thoughts in here that challenge and take you into some places that maybe you hadn't thought so much about. So rewilding is really sort of gaining rapid popularity, I think. It's all this idea of rebalancing our lives, bringing nature back in, reconnecting ourselves, reconnecting nature, breaking the broken connections. It's a lot to do with releasing our control and maybe a little bit less homogeneity in the way we manage land, and embracing the complexity rather than being scared by it. And I put up this photograph on this slide because particularly in Scotland, you're starting to see a lot more scenes like this where trees are starting to come back on the hill. And I think it's what a lot of people think of with rewilding. And what is it? Well, I think it essentially comes down to allowing habitats to heal. So there's an assumption in there already, but we'll move on, which is, you know, where habitats are damaged or where the natural systems are felt to have broken down, it's starting to heal those. And alongside that, to start to restore the missing wildlife, and particular species which I suppose become iconic when people think of wilding, that will help rebalance the natural systems, but maybe ones are the ones that we don't tend to think about so much are things like the insects, and maybe we don't think so much about what's in the soil or what's in the water. It tends to be the things that you can see, and that links to this thing of reintroducing keystone species, the species which, if you like, have a big impact. So there's been quite a lot of discussion, not in Britain so much, but in other countries, about the use of the wolf and how that's affected the whole of the ecological system by the way that it predates and changes then the grazing patterns and everything else that are happening. So by introducing one or two species, you can create some massive changes. But I'm focusing on the uplands, and I'm focusing on the British uplands, and I think that starts to then raise a lot of other questions, which I'll come on to. It's also about being a little bit more accepting of natural disturbance, rebuilding the ecological connectivity, and expanding the trophic complexity. So really just all the interactions that are happening, getting those back happening again, rebuilding that. So I put there, releasing some of our control. I think we do have this temptation to want to control everything. And this is very definitely about not having to control everything. So I put in a few examples, some of which people may have heard of or seen. One of the ones that, in fact, they've been highlighted quite a lot recently because they've just produced a little video about a single tree that was standing in this valley. The Carafran Valley. This is just in southern Scotland, very, very close to the town of Moffat, if anybody know that area. And the Carafran Valley has been over 10, 15 years now, slowly rebuilding the habitat, and a lot of tree planting going on particularly, and you can see in these pictures to the extent to which that's now happening. That's part of a bigger area, the Tallaght Fell area, which there's a number of people within the local community who are now working to expand, if you like, the learning and the things that have been happening in Carafran to a much bigger area. Benay is one that probably People have heard about it. It's a national nature reserve. It's been one of the very first national nature reserves. And this is just a very quick bit of footage of the reserve and what it looks like. This was actually very heavily logged in the wars, with the timber being taken for use, all types of uses during the First and Second World War. But it's got this very open aspect to it, and you look at it and you think, okay, well, wilding, what's happening, what's going on? And I think this is quite an interesting one, because it's not necessarily about replanting or recreating very dense forest. It may be much more open, and a lot of the mountain forests probably were more open, and people who are used to spending a lot more time overseas will be aware that forest systems are not necessarily dense forest. And I think very often people are used to looking at a plantation here in the UK and consequently think, okay, well, a forest has to look like that, where the trees are very densely together. And obviously they're not necessarily. Having said that, as I say, this area of forest was heavily cropped out. Now regeneration is starting to rebuild what's there. But it's not just about sort of old gnarly trees. In truth, a lot of them may be just what was left from logging that happened at certain points in time in history. Okay, so here's another one. This is a much more recent. This is a Trees for Life area in Dundregan, which is, I suppose, halfway between Fort William and Inverness, just off the Great Glen. It's obviously decided it's going to play very, very slowly. Here we go. Oh, now it's gone very quickly just to make up for it. So this area of forest is even more open, much more mixed species, really. But what's interesting here is this is one of the areas where they've reintroduced pigs, and they're using the pigs to root up the ground. They also root up the bracken. So there's this kind of thinking about, how did the natural system rebuild itself? What would be in there? What are the species? What are the animals? And how would they work together, if you like? And obviously, a lot of people have concern about the amount of bracken that's now on the hillside. In the past, bracken would have been very heavily used. It would have been used for bedding, for stock. But you would also, it even got used on roofs, but it would also have been rooted up a lot more than it is now by having a bigger range of animals out there, and particularly the wild boar. So some of the pigs that are being used, for those of you who are more used to your livestock, you probably have heard of the Tamworths. They're a fairly classic pig for going in and rooting everything up. They're also pretty well renowned for getting out under fences and everything else. But they're helping to sort of control the bracken. So this area there's a lot of regeneration happening here. Interestingly, around this area that's owned by Trees for Life, there are also, if you look across the valley and you look into other areas nearby, there's a lot of regeneration of natural forest starting to take place. So it's not by any means just happening within these identified wilding areas. So I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about where it all sits and where I suppose we sit inside this system. There's been a lot of conversations, I suppose, about wilding it being this kind, well, you put a fence around it, you just let it go, it'll sort itself out. And then there's, well, actually, no, we need to be a little bit more progressive than that. We need to think about, well, has the system already been so damaged that it's reached a point that it's not able to progress, it's not able to change, or at least if it does, it'll take a very, very long time. And so you have some sort of disturbance, or you may use tree planting. To give an example, as the glaciers retreating up in the mountain, then probably the trees will be coming up from sea level, working their way slowly up behind the glaciers. There'd be a seed source that's working its way up. And we're in this strange situation now where in some places there may not actually be any seed source. The seed source and where you want the trees are completely separated. So all of those kind of relationships and those linkages may have started to break down, and it's very case dependent on the area and the place. But also we have had a very strong relationship with that land, and it's not just in the lowlands, not in the highlands, it's everywhere. So rewilding it's not something you can pick it out and say, right, we're going to have this wild area and then everything else is for people, because people are actually part of that system. And this is something I'll come back to time and again, probably through the talk, because I think there's this temptation to move towards the thinking that it all has to be this pristine wilderness. And when I talk to people about what that means, they're often talking about it as if people aren't in there. And I've been very lucky, I've worked in some very remote areas. So to give you an example, working very remote parts of Alaska, up in the forested areas there. And even there, where you see something as pristine wilderness, actually, if you go in and look at it, the way that people have been cropping it, even just to collect berries, or the way that they've been going in maybe to cut the odd tree, or that they've been using a particular area more heavily than others, where the mountain drops down to the sea, there's been incredibly intensive aquaculture centuries ago. So the idea that that is some sort of pristine where people aren't there and have never been there it doesn't work. So this spectrum is really starting to look at that and identify, well, where do different forms of, if you like, the concept of wilding fit in that continuum? And rather than saying it's wild or it's not wild, I'm not going to get too much into the thing about wilding and rewilding. There's also a lot of debate in there as to what that actually means. So I'm speaking quite broadly here, but I think the degree of human modification is quite a useful way of thinking about the system. Whether you then consider something that has a degree of human modification in it as being wild, we'll come on to. And this is another one, another cartoon, a graphic, which has been drawn up to sort of look a little bit more at this relationship between people and our current systems of management, be it nature reserves, SSR, sorry, sites of special scientific interest, wildlife trust reserves or whatever. Where do they fit in this picture of what wilder spaces might look like? I wouldn't fully agree with everything that's on this diagram, but it helps to give a sort of representation of what maybe what a lot of wilding is trying to do, and particularly when we're in the mountain environment, this thing of scale becomes very important and very relevant. But obviously, I think even if you look at those Okavango, the Yellowstone, whatever, they've all been incredibly heavily influenced by how people have used land over the centuries. So even in some of the ones that you might see as bigger and wilder, there's still quite a lot of human interaction within those places. So I was playing around, and I'm sorry the video is quite small, but it's a little bit of fun. You imagine the system just slowly building up, and those connections are happening naturally. The ecological connections between the different species is happening over a very, very long periods of time through the evolution. And I was playing around with this, just doing it actually for a lake and saying, well, how's that system developed? And what's happened over the years, particularly where more homogeneous situations have started to develop because of people's interaction, if you like, is that species then start to disappear. And this graphic I actually did not for a mountain environment, but actually for the Broads in Norfolk, just playing it through again, seeing those things slowly starting to come into a system so that it builds and develops. Imagine then if you're starting to remove them again. And that's basically what's been happening over time by our interactions. So there's classic periods of time where that's happened. But as they've been taken out, you reach these critical points where you start taking any more species out of that system and it really does start to collapse. And that's where a lot of concern is, that the systems that we're working with in the mountains, lowlands, or any other environment. So at a point now where we've taken so many species out of them, we've disconnected them to such a degree that they're no longer fully functional. And they're at a point where it could become really quite damaging. As this little niggle of, there we are. Okay. So just very quickly run through a few thoughts on why this might have come about. I've been very lucky. You might notice there's some of these photos have been led to me by some friends who do wildlife photography. So I'm very lucky because there's some stunning little images. But the examples of why it's come about, and I'm putting here, I mean, I'm being quite broad brush here. We've got a limited amount of time, but things like, as soon as you start to introduce grants to a system, funding systems, so people often refer to the grants that have supported agriculture or the grants that have supported forestry, and there's many others. Also the grants that support the conservation movement, and how that's then behaved. There's been market manipulation. So probably there's a lot of people on this talk there, you know, and probably therefore varying levels of understanding of how much that happens. But an awful lot of the product that we have from natural resources, be it from here in the UK or overseas, is subject to manipulation of the market by pricing, restructuring, import taxes, and God knows what else. And also obviously linked to that is the policy, the government policies and so on that drive the decision making. And I think it's probably fair to say that as a result of a lot of those, we have ended up with situations where homogeneity and reducing diversity is actually driven by those very things that are trying to support, let's say, good agricultural practice or greater production of timber, or even better wildlife rich environments, because they've been done at such a large scale in a very much to make it equitable. It's ended up actually leading to a reduction of diversity, and I include in that a reduction in the diversity of the way that people manage their land. We've also got this thing of over specialization, working greater inputs, the work to monocultures and so on. And I know that we tend to think of that being a lowland thing. And yeah, for many of the agricultural systems, it is something that you see more evident in lowland. But what about Sitka spruce monocropping in forest systems in the mountains? What about where, as a result of various subsidies and systems, we've seen a change in the range and of both types of animals that are grazed, but also how they're grazed and what breeds are being used. Over managing ? Is interesting, because there's always a tension here as to how much management is acceptable. Where does rewilding sit in that? As I said earlier on, it's actually a spectrum. So it's not as easy to say, well, actually that land shouldn't be being managed. And you hear reference to projects where there is no management. I would challenge that. There are very few examples at all that I can think of where there isn't some form of intervention. And even if you are only taking people in for tourism, you are likely to be creating disturbance. So therefore you will be managing the level of disturbance. So I think there's some quite interesting challenges to how we maybe initially start to think about what wilding and rewilding might be. There's also a tendency for us to think about what we can see. So when we're thinking about how we're working with habitats and mountain environments and or our production systems, we're very often focusing on the bits we can see. We're focusing on the animal or the bird or possibly the insect if we make the effort to look more closely. How often are we actually thinking about the soil systems and the infrastructure and the relationships with the geology and the relationships of the water systems and the riparian, the stream and river environments, the things that we can't necessarily see connected, the mycorrhizae between the fungal relationships. And I'll touch back on some of these as we go on. Another reason I think a lot of changes is technological advances appearing that simplify the system or allow us to change things in a way that we couldn't in the past. And at a very simplistic level, I was thinking about this and talking to a friend many years ago. I used to do a lot of contracting in Snowdonia on farms and for conservation work. And I was reflecting that, you know, when I first started out doing fencing contracting, we were carrying rolls of Rylock fence up the side of the mountain. Now you just throw it on the back of a motorbike and drive it up there. You know, that wasn't possible. It didn't exist. And there's been things like a significant increase in the amount of silage produced and haylage produced, and even the fact that we can put fences up more easily, not just because of the machinery for carrying the Rylock up the hill, but there's a number of things that have changed even in the time that probably many of us have been wandering up and down the mountainside. And I think another thing that's come about that's really pushed this desire and agenda for wilding in whatever way you sort of want to interpret it, it's the speed of change. And I talked earlier about a little bit about the driving forward things like the grant system and so on. The speed of change has been really quite dramatic. Okay, so I've already mentioned here a little bit the hidden examples, but maybe just to touch a little bit more on those. So soil is one that I think is particularly important, and in the mountain environment where plants and animals are often pushed to their extremes, the connections within the soil, and I mean, obviously the depth of the soil and the geological system that's created that soil is important, but the live connections in the soil then become really important as well. And obviously erosion can have impact on that, leaching can have impact on that, but also the stuff that we're putting onto the ground will have significant impact on the soils themselves. And I think it's something that often is forgotten about because, again, we tend to look at the things that are there right in front of us. Looking underwater, and I put in this photograph because obviously in many areas of Britain where we've got the mountains, they drop right down to the sea. And whilst I know we're talking about in mountain environments, I think quite a few of us spend time in the mountain environments where we maybe got there by kayak or something else as well. And how often do we think about what's under the water? How often are we thinking about, and there is quite a lot going on around rewilding the sea, rewilding the marine systems. And I mentioned earlier the Broads. That, you know, there's this rewilding of or wilding of our aquatic systems. Insects and microbes, again, and mycorrhizae. I mean, I've touched on those. Again, you know, things that we need to be thinking about in terms of what we can't see. And I've mentioned already, time is really important. Time of change. The connectivity between things is another one I think we need to spend more time thinking about when we're looking at wilder or more natural systems, naturalized systems, if you like. And porosity, how easy can things move from one place to another? Okay, so who's in control? This is a biggie because a lot of wilding, the concepts and the thinking behind it is really about releasing control. And a lot of what we tend to do is think, well, how do we manage it? How do we control it? How do we make it do what we want it to do? I've said on this slide, the greater emphasis on the natural systems. being clear that when I'm talking about natural, I'm talking for what many people would call the semi-natural, because really all of our systems we are involved in, and the natural system, we are part of it. Okay, so briefly touching on to reintroductions, the sexy bit maybe, you know, things like conversations about red squirrels, beavers, pine martens, red kites, white-tailed seagulls, but also think about tree planting. You know, often it's a reintroduction of trees back into that area. And I mentioned pigs and wild boars earlier on, but these are some of the species that are being reintroduced into areas to try and rebuild some of those connections. I put these lovely photos in of beaver, which of course you can't see a beaver, because every time I ever go and look for them, this is all I ever see. So I think as well, there's a lot of thought for people that, you know, you'll be able to go out to these places and see these fantastic animals and birds and everything else. And sometimes they're actually very, very elusive, which I think for many people can be slightly frustrating, but equally that's part of the fun of it, isn't it? Going looking for them. But these species, the ones I put up here, there's been various levels of how controversial they are, some more so than others. And I've been involved in consultations on a number of these, but I'll come back a little bit to this. And some examples, it's not all about the mountains. So I do think there tends to be a bit of a reflection, oh, we're going to rewild, let's go and find a mountain area to do it in. And actually, it's not really quite how it works. And in fact, I think if it is working like that, in my view, we've got something seriously wrong. But there's some interesting stuff happening. I mean, in Kent, there's already been the beavers introduction. There's a project at the moment looking at European bison. The Norfolk Broads, there's some interesting work looking at reinvigorating aquatic habitats. The Knepp Estate, probably many of you have heard about, which is an estate in the south of England that's allowed a form of wilding to take place on its land. And then obviously the white-tailed seagull, which has been in the news quite a lot relatively recently, the reintroduction in Isle of Wight. Some people say we can't do it in these very urbanized environments or these places near people. Well, you can. It's just different. And I think this is one of the keys about wilding. Its understanding is a lot more complex and nuanced than at first sight. And the fact it's being done in some place in Holland, I think says something quite clearly. Okay, Jim, over to you.
Okay. I am gonna, we'll have a quick break for a minute. Steve, there's been some interesting questions. So we'll save those until the end. Those of you who are familiar with Kahoots, if you take a phone or another device and you type in www.kahoot.it, then we're going to go, we've got a 5-question quiz. A code will pop up in a second. And I'll tell you the code. So if you'd like to play along, it's loading the pin. So the pin is 9599859. So if you haven't got a second mobile or another device, then just play along. It's just five simple questions about wilding in the UK. Okay, I think we'll make a start now. There's only one of these on this evening's presentation. True or false? There are almost 1,000 beavers in the UK. And it is true. I found these questions the other day just out of interest. So yeah, almost 1,000 beavers. Well done, Claire. Wilder Blean in Kent is launching a wilding project, including the reintroduction of which animal? Steve might have just alluded to the answer to this a minute ago. But yeah, European bison. Okay, well done, TG. Question 3. White stork chicks have successfully hatched in West Sussex, the first in Britain for how many years? Another fantastic story. And it was in the 1400s, so 600 years they've been absent from Britain. So that's a great success story. What am Mike? The white-tailed seagull is being reintroduced to which British island? Used to be present all along the south coast of England. Yeah, the Isle of Wight. Yeah, so it was native along the south coast. What a Mike. And then the final question. The world's first recorded reintroduction was from Sweden to Scotland in 1832. But which species was it? Bit of a giveaway. I give the answer in the picture as you've worked out. And it was the capercaillie. So well done, most of you getting that right. So Go Wild in Britain on the podium tonight. Well done, Mike, 4 out of 5. Rod, fantastic, with 5 out of 5. Andy, superb, well done. Okay, I'll stop my sharing now, and I'll hand back control to Steve. So some interesting questions, Steve. We'll come back to those at the end.
I hope they're not as hard as the Kahoot ones. I don't know if I got any of those. Right. Great. So one of the things I wanted to touch on is the concept of wilding, and I've alluded to this already a little bit through some of my talk, and particularly highlighting some of the issues that get raised in our mountain environments. And I have been involved in working with some work in Wales, and particularly recently in mid Wales. And I think there's some really important issues that need to be thought about and understood if we're starting to think about wilding in these mountain environments. I think there's a danger of making a lot of assumptions. And particularly when things have happened as a result of things that have been going on for a very long time, it's very easy to assume that they're still continuing. I hear quite a lot of comments about various farming practices that are particularly damaging, and therefore this is causing this problem. And actually the farming practices stopped 10 years ago. But the result is still very evident and still very much there. And so people are saying something about a system that isn't actually being continued at the moment. I'm not saying that's true for everything, but there are those examples.
Steve, can I just stop you a second? Are you sharing your screen again?
I think I am. Sorry, I'll check it again. Do you want me to switch it off and try it again?
Well, just try. I don't have it, so I don't know if other people have got the same problem.
Right, that's very odd. Okay, let me just see if I can sort that out. Can you see that now, Jim?
Yeah, that's coming up now. Yeah, that's great.
Right. Sorry, I had to reconfigure it. Okay, not sure why that happened. Apologies, everyone. Okay, you've got a nice picture to look at now anyway while you listen to me droning on. So I think you've got to be very careful of assumptions, and we have to have an understanding of what the local ecosystems are actually like, how do they function, not just look at them in a superficial way and think, well, this is what that should look like, or this is what that should be. There's controversy around the issue of food and production of any form of goods from natural resources, and where does that sit in relation to wilding? Because a lot of our mountain environments are also a place where the mountain is providing food, wood, water, all sorts of other resources which are important to us. And if we're going to say we're not going to have that resource anymore, where are we going to get it from? And food's one that is often raised, because if you're not going to actually be growing the food in the local area and you're going to be importing it, surely you're going to have a significant environmental impact as a result of doing that. Where are the greatest risks and opportunities? And the reason I put that in is because I think very often, and this isn't true just with the mountain environment, we jump straight in on, here's a problem, here's a solution. And actually, is it the thing that was causing the greatest problem? Is it the greatest risk of change? Or is it one that will actually sort itself out over time, or through some fairly minor tweaks in our management approaches or whatever? And there's a danger of this kind of very rapid kick to a change that's been happening over a long time, and then, oh my God, this is so terrible, we suddenly have to deal with it, and we throw our hands up in horror and react, and consequently sometimes can cause more damage as a result. Now, I'm being very generic, and obviously there are examples where we need to move a bit quicker, and climate change is a very good example. I think there's a number of areas where we're species loss in the UK, horrendous, and worldwide. We really need to be moving a bit quicker. But I think it's about which things we need to be moving quicker on. I mean, it's a little bit sharper, maybe, not use blunt instruments. A big concern with the wilding agenda, and this isn't true just in the mountain environments, but particularly coming up in mountain environments, and particularly in areas where a large number of the population live and work and rely on the resources of those places. So it particularly come to a head in Wales, and some of the projects, it's a discussion point, certainly with projects I'm working on, even in some fairly rather more sparsely populated areas in Scotland. And that is, where's the money coming from, and what are people actually trying to do? So if you start getting people coming in and buying up areas of land, that smacks of some form of colonialism. And if that's meaning that land is being removed from the people that have lived and worked there for many centuries, and suddenly that's being, okay, now we're just going to buy that all up and we'll rewild it. What's the impact there? And is that actually, are the people coming in the ones with the knowledge? And why are they buying it? Are they buying it because they genuinely want to support a redevelopment of the ecological system? Or are they buying it because it's a good way of making themselves feel better because they've made loads of money on shares in some fairly devastating industry? So there's a lot of controversy, a lot of questions being asked there. A big one for me as well is, you have to start thinking, are humans in or humans out? There is a lot of discussion where there's almost an assumption that humans aren't part of the ecological system. I'm sorry, I think that's nonsense. And we need to start to think a lot more of how people fit within that system. And then there's an area of controversy that concerns people, particularly obviously from in the farming and landowning community, the ones who are particularly using the land rather than just happen to own a lot of land, around how they're being portrayed and their relationship with the land and the place. So these are issues I think it's really important that people are aware of as you start to think about where wilding does or doesn't have a role and what it actually looks like in different places. And linked to that, obviously, we've got a very long history with the land. So this isn't something that's new. And this issue of power and control isn't new either. There's plenty of examples of people who've been given the land for fighting for the king. The monastic movement even getting land given to it to support the church and support what was going on at the time. With that comes a huge amount of power and control. Well, who are the people who are actually there already surviving off that land? And so the idea that we can come in and just take something over and do something with it without some form of engagement in that, I think is causing a lot of concern. And it's not new. It's been going on for a long, long time. I think there's also a question in the period of history as to how much people have actually created diversity, as well as more recent history, particularly where there's serious concern about our negative impacts. If we are part of the ecological system, it's quite interesting to start to think about and understand more about how we work with that system over time and how those things have changed. And I've referred to a few things like, you know, the clearances in Scotland and the impact of those. That's why there's no people in some of these areas now. And I mentioned hunter-gatherers through the intensive farming practices. You know, there's a lot happened over time where we've had influence. And I know the mountain environment is that much different. It's often a lot less intensive. There are small pockets where it is intensive, but we are obviously having a change through time, and we need to be thinking and considering that and understanding that when we're looking at wilding. And I'd also reflect back to, we've got to be a little bit careful as to how we then interpret and take that history forward. So to give one example, yes, there used to be Iron Age hill forts on a lot of our hill areas, particularly, and in the lower parts of the mountain. And they would have been a lot of the tree clearance had probably happened well before that, but there would have then been a lot of grazing and so on going on as a result of those communities. But don't forget, the climate's changed since then as well. So we can't sort of jump back to a point and say, what, we want it to look like that, because we're not comparing like with like, and we're not looking at a system that is the same as it was then. The pictures here I thought I just put up for I thought they were nice images to reflect on. So the one with the sheep and the old building looking out from, it's actually in Wales, looking out to the Llŷn Peninsula, and just thinking about the sheep and, you know, when they came and how they've been here and what they've been doing in all that time and all the associations and relationships with that land. The bottom right-hand one is actually, believe it or not, an old settlement used for drovers. That used to be an absolute hive of industry, of people. Well, industry may be the wrong phrase. Probably a lot of drink and goodness knows what else going on there as people were passing through. And the other one is a house what it looks in a very wild area. In fact, that's one of the old cottages for the people who were managing the shoot and the fishing. Okay, so I've mentioned quite a few of these, and I'll rattle through this bit of it a little bit more quickly, but just being careful of assumptions. We're out for our walk, we're out working in the mountain environments, we're looking around and thinking about it. Think about the context, think about that history, be careful about you know, the assumptions of what wilding should look like in any particular place. And I think I would, well, no, I would highly recommend that we take a lesson from the lessons of many interferences in overseas development programs of the past, and that is learn from local knowledge. Don't just come in and make assumptions based on reading some interesting scientific papers, and not actually spend the time to really learn and understand what's been going on in the area. And the more that power is removed from local people, and the more that they're not part of the process, the more that you're likely to see some fairly negative reactions, and for good reason. And I think also equally as important in that is that if we're genuinely seeing ourselves in, not out, then we need to think of ourselves in that ecological system. And it's not then just coming in and saying, well, here's a bit of land, we can just wild it. The issue of power and control I've mentioned in the controversy, and I think it's a really important one to bear in mind and to understand. And so, yes, there's some exciting projects happening. Yes, there's some really interesting benefits starting to take place for natural systems. But I do think that we've got to bear in mind how that plays out through the long term. I'm not saying we shouldn't be building ecological systems, and I think in some places, some of these approaches are absolutely the right way forward, but it's how they're being done and whether they're actually integrated with an understanding of people and the place and what goes on there. I've mentioned this thing about the point in history. You know, where are we going back to? Sometimes people say, well, you know, people are the only ones who've created these massive changes to the ecological system. My comment is usually go and have a watch elephants in Africa for a little while and tell me that after you've watched them for a bit. Or go and have a look at termites and their impacts. And if you put that into a UK context, think about the woolly mammoths that used to be wandering around. You know, the impact that they were having on the system is massive. And there are a lot of species that significantly change their habitat, not just people. I probably should say here, I am actually an ecologist and forester and done a lot of work with ecological systems. So I'm not saying that we haven't got a problem and that we don't need to rebuild. I very definitely am saying we do need to be thinking a lot more about that. What I'm raising here is points around some of the things that we need to be considering and understanding a lot more, rather than just coming in with a single point of view. It's not a them and us, it's not a straight line. I put in the overgrazing or thin acidic soils, basically because I often hear of comments like, oh, this area is overgrazed. There are cases where there probably has been there has been significant ecological damage because it has been grazed too heavily for a period of time by a particular type of stock. That's not the same necessarily as there's not very much here because it's actually a very thin acidic soil. Blankets of natural forestry, you know, it'd be lovely to see more forests, but and natural forests, but we've got an awful lot of blanket forestry of monoculture, haven't we? And we need to think more about what is it that we're dealing with. Would the area have actually genuinely be a blanketed forest, or would it have been broken up forest? And, you know, thinking back to some of those pictures I had earlier on. And where's the available seed? And I mentioned earlier this thing about the movement in behind the glacier. Okay, I'm going to go through a few just quick thoughts. They're partially linked very much with the mountain, but also with everything that we're doing. And I'm going to go through fairly quickly these, so we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A. But I think we need to think as well as wilding in this idea of having these very, if you like, where nature really dominates and people, we possibly even not removing people from the system, because if we, as I said earlier, if we even go in with a pair of binoculars, you are having impact on the system, like it or not. But maybe we think much more about some of our natural production systems as well and integrate that much more with our thinking in that spectrum of wilder. Working with local, cropping more from the wild maybe, or how might that look? What types of cropping are going to be appropriate within these wilder places that we start to recreate? What's appropriate? Mixing of species within our grazing stock. So, you know, it won't be a natural system if there's no grazing in there. So if it may be that we actually say, well, we can produce, I used the example of the Knepp estate earlier on, they're still cropping the animals for meat. There's still a level of harvesting going on. So it's thinking maybe about a broader range of types of stock. Definitely reducing inputs, and particularly the unnatural inputs, the ones that are completely man-made. The unnatural control of insects and of other parts of the food system. And I mentioned briefly permaculture. For those of you who aren't aware of it, it's quite an interesting one to look at. It's a very nice way of using the ecological system to think about design and how do we work with nature into the future. I'm also doing a lot of work around nature-based economy. So I just thought I'd put this in because one of the things that I think is very important, and it comes back to that relationship with people and are we in or are we out, is everything we're doing, if we're buying food, if we're buying wood, if we're buying any form of natural resource-based product, we are having, whether we like it or not, an impact on nature and the natural world. And I don't think we give that anywhere near enough thought. And I think our understanding of which things we're doing and how they affect wildlife in the natural world is really quite weak. It's not about, nature-based tourism is not just, sorry, nature-based economy is not just about tourism. And the mountains is not just a playground. It's not just somewhere where we can go as a tourist or a visitor and have a nice time. And maybe thinking about these things like, the sort of value of local food, the guiding and how much we can raise awareness by the people that we're taking out in the mountain, rather than just using it as a place to walk through. How much are we challenging them with some of these sorts of thinking? What cropping is appropriate and where is it appropriate? And how do we manage land for wildlife, but also for benefit? And I finished that bit with, and what are we all buying? Does anybody think about it? So a few quick thoughts. It's an exciting concept, rewilding and wilding. But, think about what we can do at home, not just think about what somebody else should be doing in the mountains. Think about what we're doing in our daily lives. Don't make assumptions, embrace local knowledge, get involved and let people, learn from it. And, hopefully even better, the local people will be driving the change if there needs to be. And actually it's not about coming in and telling people how to do something. That's probably about the worst thing you can do. Put ourselves back into the system and think about everything as a continual rebalancing. There is no right answer. What the only answer I would say is that we need to be continually embracing change and accepting that we can always improve. Conservation, environmentalism, any of these things should be about always trying to do better and always trying to rebalance ourselves better within the system that we're part of. I've just put a quick summary comment in there, which really is already pretty much what I've said. People sometimes say to me, so how can I get involved? Well, here's a few quick examples: volunteering, citizen science, helping with financial support, but I would please do it in a way that's actually working with and through local people, not doing two. And raising awareness with those maybe that we're taking out into the mountains and helping them understand some of this nuancing. How can we help? Well, we could rewild ourselves. That'd be a really good start. Consider a bit more about what we buy. As I say, right understanding in others. And it's not just about the mountains. As I say here, it's even about what you do with your own lawn. Do we really only need one type of grass and no moss in the lawn? Anyway. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry if I went on a bit and rattled through some fairly massive topic areas, but thanks very much for your time. And yeah, Jim, over to you.
No, that was great, Steve. Thank you very much. As you said, a very broad topic and, many aspects there. So, and that reflects in some of the comments and questions. Going back, just running through from the beginning, what do you mean by allowing natural disturbance? Maybe that's been answered now, but.
Okay, well, allowing natural disturbance, gosh, it's got lots of connotations, but maybe an easy one to use, just to give it as an example, is the use of the beaver. So the beaver is a great natural disturber. It gets in there, it drops trees, it creates dams, it changes water systems, it holds water back, which can help reduce serious flooding. Doesn't reduce flooding necessarily, but can reduce serious impact flooding and have benefits. So by changing the way we're working with the natural process and the natural disturbances that are happening.
Okay, a couple of things that popped up about bracken, whether or not it's native, it's invasive. John Good mentioned that it's used to it was controlled by grazing. By trampling, sorry, and the change and the reduction in cattle grazing has had an effect on it in the mountains.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
There was something about less reliability on the common agricultural policy and more in ecosystem services. We need more emphasis there. Heather said there's some cool projects in Cumbria, like Hard Knot Forest Restoration Project,
Yeah.
and Beavers recently released at Lowther.
Yeah.
Where do we go?
Can I just one quick comment, Jim? The one about so the one about Bracken, yeah, totally. And I think you know there's a lot of discussion around how we can get more cattle back on the hill. And I think I would also like to suggest that we could potentially be seeing. I think it would be good to get pigs back onto certain areas of the hill as well. But I think it has to work in conjunction with what works best on the particular holdings and in the area. And some areas it's relevant, some it isn't. But that disturbance factor on Bracken is absolutely fundamental and really important. The point about the ecosystem services. Again, I would agree, but I think that we need to be a little bit careful that we don't end up too far down the line of blanket prescriptions. And I think that's where a lot of our current problems have come from. If we can actually get more of an understanding where there's a proper dialogue with the landowners at the land holding level around what's right and what works and what doesn't on that land, and an agreement is developed around that, rather than anybody who does this should do this, then I think we're going to be in a much better place. So it's putting more control back into the natural diversity that people create.
Okay. Just quite an interesting one from Mike just at the end there about local knowledge and questioning it, and how much we should trust in that, because of, you know, managing traditions of managing the land. You know, and the idea of burning off the gorse, but that gorse is a nursery for rowan seedlings and so on. So, like, it's an ongoing thing, I guess, isn't it? That
yeah, it's a total. It's there's no. This is where I get. You're absolutely right to pick up on this. I think we'll be ever so careful we don't get into this them and us. It's not about somebody from outside knows best, and it's not about somebody from inside the system knows best. It's actually that they both have different states of knowledge. And I think very often what we're doing, and I've done a huge amount of work working on basically public engagement in fairly big and difficult environmental situations. And I think that it's fair to say that what you're always trying to do is to bring all of the different perspectives into a common decision space, so that people start to talk it through and understand perspectives and understand the different opportunities and constraints and so on, and from that start to identify what's right for an area. But certainly, I mean, if you go from one extreme of saying, oh well, it's the expert that knows, and you go to the other extreme of saying, well, you have to be a local to know, then no, that's not going to work. And again, both extremes have been tried in different places and they don't work, as you would imagine.
Yeah. Well, Steve, that wraps up. Lots of comments saying thank you very much. Excellent talk. So yes, thank you all very much for attending. I do finish my talks with a quick online review. So you should see that screen there. So keeping in touch with me, we've got future webinars in this series. Next week, Paul Gannon talking on geology of the Peak District. Then I'll be talking about Britain's glacial heritage, back with Paul Gannon with the ecology of the Alps. And then John Roberts going to talk about archaeology in the mountains, which should be interesting as well. Just at the end, the way I'd like my feedback, if you've got any comments or any thoughts, if you type in on a phone, again, if you've got a phone, you can type in on a web browser, www.menti.com. And if you were to type in the code 6950275, 6950275, then there's a couple of slides just for you to share your thoughts on that. The code should be at the top of that screen as well, at menti.com. There we go. Thought-provoking, reassuring, fascinating, complex. I think that's something that we can take from this. So, and it is very topical. Excellent. There you go. That's how people are rating it so far. That's fantastic. If there's any comments that come in later on, then I can share them with you. I'll send you an email. And Steve, if it's okay with you, can I share your presentation with everyone afterwards? If anyone wanted to recap on anything.
Yeah, happy to do so, Jim. Maybe if you and I just have a quick check to make sure it covers all the questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there we go. That's fantastic. So thank you all very much. I'll share that on my Facebook page later, and then I'll give any feedback with you through the an email if there's anything that crops up there. So I'll have a chat with Steve afterwards. So thank you all very much for attending again, and the fireworks going off outside, so we all know what day it is. So yeah, hope you have a lovely, enjoyable evening, and we will see you again hopefully. Bye bye for now.